It is September 15, 2008. The air conditioning on the trading floor of Lehman Brothers is humming, but nobody is moving. $1 trillion of wealth is evaporating in real time, deleting retirement accounts from Ohio to Osaka. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the bankruptcy itself, it was the silence of the models. For 20 years, the smartest mathematicians on Earth, physicists who used to map the stars, had built a financial engine they swore was unbreakable. They claimed they had conquered risk. They claimed they had turned the chaotic, messy uncertainty of the American housing market into a pristine, risk-free equation. They were wrong. And they didn't just get the math wrong by a few decimal points. They built a doomsday machine that relied on a single, fatal lie. The belief that if you package enough garbage together, it somehow turns into gold. Today, we aren't just looking at the 2008 crash, we are opening the hood of the CDO machine to understand the specific mechanical gears that ground the global economy to dust. We are going to look at the Gaussian copula, the mathematical formula that killed Wall Street. This isn't a history lesson, it is an autopsy. To understand how the world broke, we have to go back to a boring, beige office in the 1980s. Back then, if you wanted a mortgage, you sat across from a local banker. He looked you in the eye. He checked your pay stubs. And most importantly, if you didn't pay him back, he lost money. This is called originate to hold. The bank originates the loan, and they hold the risk. It was safe, it was stable, and for Wall Street, it was agonizingly slow. Fast forward to the early 2000s. The walls are glass, the suits are Italian, and the philosophy has changed entirely. The new model was originate to distribute. The local bank lends you money, but they don't keep the loan. Within days, they sell it to a massive investment bank on Wall Street. The local bank gets their fee and washes their hands of you. They don't care if you default in 2 years, it's not their problem anymore. This shift broke the fundamental bond of banking. It turned mortgages from a relationship into a raw material, a commodity like corn or steel that could be mined, processed, and sold to strangers. So, how do you turn a house in Florida into a bond traded in London? The process is called securitization. Think of it like a meat grinder. An investment bank buys thousands of individual mortgages, some good, some okay, some terrible. They throw them all into a giant pool, the grinder. They mix them up until you can't tell one loan from another. Then they press a button, and out comes a sausage. This sausage is called a mortgage-backed security, or MBS. Instead of owning one person's debt, an investor buys a slice of the sausage. Every month, thousands of homeowners pay their mortgages. That cash flows into the pool, and the investors get a check. On paper, this looks brilliant. It spreads the risk. If one guy in the pool defaults, the other 999 cover him. It creates liquidity. It allows pension funds to invest in the American dream. But there is a catch. When you are buying sausage, you trust the butcher to use high-quality meat. But because the butcher, the mortgage originator, was paid by the pound, they stopped checking the quality. They just needed more meat for the grinder. This is where you, the viewer, need to pay attention. The complexity of finance is often a mask for simple fraud. By 2004, the machine was hungry. The prime borrowers, people with good jobs and high credit scores, already had houses. The pool of good meat was drying up. But Wall Street demanded more sausages. So, the standards were lowered. First, it was low-doc loans. Then it was no-doc loans. Finally, we reached the apex of insanity, the ninja loan. No income, no job, no assets. Lenders were giving $500,000 checks to strawberry pickers and part-time bartenders, knowing full well they couldn't make the first payment. Why? Because the lender made a fee on the sale, and Wall Street made a fee on the securitization. Everyone was getting rich on the transaction, not the repayment. If you want to understand how money truly moves, and how to spot when the game is rigged against you, you need to join the community we are building here. Subscribe to Capital Curriculum. We don't just read the news, we track the incentives. Because in 2004, the incentives were screaming that a crash was coming, but nobody wanted to listen because the music was too loud. The result of this gluttony was the subprime explosion. Subprime implies less than prime, but in reality it meant toxic. These loans often came with adjustable rates, teaser rates that would start at 1% and then explode to 10% after 2 years. The banks knew the borrowers would default when the rates reset. They didn't care. They assumed that house prices would keep rising forever. If the borrower couldn't pay, they could just sell the house at a profit. It was a Ponzi scheme built on drywall and cheap lumber. But here is the problem. Wall Street had so much subprime debt that they couldn't sell it all as standard mortgage-backed securities. Pension funds and insurance companies are legally required to buy safe assets, AAA-rated bonds. They couldn't buy this subprime garbage. Wall Street needed a way to disguise the toxic waste as gold bullion. They needed a new machine. They needed the CDO. Enter the collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. This is the weapon that killed the economy. To understand a CDO, forget the complex charts for a second. Imagine a tower of champagne glasses at a wedding. You pour champagne, the mortgage payments, into the top glass. When the top glass is full, it overflows into the second tier. When those are full, they overflow into the third. In a CDO, the bankers took a pool of risky mortgage bonds and sliced them into layers, or tranches. The top layer, the senior tranche, is the top glass. It gets paid first. It is considered the safest. It gets the AAA rating. The bottom layer, the equity tranche, is the bottom glass. It only gets paid if everyone else is full. But if mortgages start to default, if the champagne stops flowing, the bottom glass dries up first. The equity tranche takes the first losses, acting as a shield for the guys at the top. This structure convinced the world that you could take a pile of B-rated, risky loans and by stacking them up, create a top layer that was mathematically safe. They convinced the world that 80% of a pile of dog excrement was actually premium brownie mix. The brilliance of the CDO was in the recycling. Wall Street would take the unsold, risky slices from regular mortgage bonds, the stuff nobody wanted, and dump them into a CDO box. Then, they would slice that box into new tranches. It was financial alchemy. They took the BBB-rated leftovers, put them in a blender, and suddenly the rating agencies stamped the top 80% of the new mixture as AAA. How? The logic was diversification. The theory was that a homeowner in Florida and a homeowner in California wouldn't default at the same time. Their risks were uncorrelated. If Florida crashes, California might still be booming, so the pool remains safe. This assumption of uncorrelated risk is the single most expensive mistake in human history. It ignored the fact that the banks were offering the same toxic loans in Florida, California, Arizona, and Nevada simultaneously. They weren't diversifying risk, they were concentrating it. But the fees were astronomical. A bank could make $2 million structuring a single CDO deal. The assembly line went into overdrive. You might be asking, where were the referees? Moody's, S&P, Fitch. These are the rating agencies whose job is to inspect the bond and tell investors if it's safe. A AAA rating is supposed to mean risk-free, as safe as the US government. But here is the conflict. The rating agencies are paid by the banks issuing the bonds. If Moody's refused to rate a toxic CDO as AAA, the bank would just walk down the street to S&P. It was a race to the bottom. We have emails from inside these agencies where analysts said things like, "This deal is ridiculous," and "It was structured by cows." Yet, the AAA stamp was applied. Why? Because the CDO boom was the biggest revenue generator the rating agencies had ever seen. They were not independent arbiters. They were part of the sales team. They used models that only looked at historical data from a period where housing prices only went up. They were driving a car at 100 miles per hour, looking exclusively in the rear-view mirror. And in that mirror, the road looked perfectly straight. Because these CDOs were stamped AAA, they went everywhere. A small-town pension fund in Norway bought them. A municipal government in Australia bought them. Why? Because in the mid-2000s, interest rates were low. Safe government bonds paid almost nothing. But these CDOs offered a slightly higher return with the same safe AAA label. It was free money, or so they thought. This is crucial to understand. The CDO machine took a localized problem, bad lending in American suburbs, and exported it to the balance sheets of every major financial institution on Earth. It turned a housing bubble into a global ticking time bomb. But Wall Street had a problem. They were running out of actual mortgages. There were only so many Americans who wanted houses. The machine needed more fuel, but the mines were empty. So they did something truly psychotic. They stopped looking for real loans and started printing imaginary ones. This is the moment the financial industry left reality behind. When they ran out of real people to lend to, they invented the synthetic CDO. A normal CDO holds actual mortgages. A synthetic CDO holds nothing but bets. It is composed of credit default swaps, CDS. Think of it like this. A normal CDO is like betting on a horse race. You bet on horse A. A synthetic CDO is two guys in the stands betting on whether your bet wins or loses. You don't need more horses. You can create infinite bets on the same race. In the housing market, this meant banks could replicate the risk of a specific pool of bad loans over and over again. They could take $1 million of bad loans and create $1 billion of synthetic derivatives referenced to it. This magnified the leverage in the system exponentially. If the underlying bonds failed, the losses wouldn't just be 1-to-1, they would be 100-to-1. The big short investors, guys like Michael Burry, realised this. They weren't just betting against the housing market. They were buying fire insurance on a house that the neighbours were dousing in gasoline. At the heart of this synthetic madness was a single formula, the Gaussian copula. Created by a mathematician named David Lee, this formula was supposed to calculate the correlation between different assets. It was elegant, it was simple, and it was tragically flawed. The model assumed that the correlation between mortgage defaults was stable. It looked at the past and said, well, if a guy in Ohio defaults, it rarely affects a guy in Florida. It treated the housing market like a bell curve. But financial crashes don't follow bell curves. They follow fat tails. Extreme events happen far more often than the model predicts. The Gaussian copula allowed banks to price these complex risks with a single number. It gave them a false sense of precision. Executives looked at the model's output, a low-risk number, and said, load the boat. They didn't understand the math. They just liked the answer it gave them. It was a mathematical lie that justified unlimited greed. The cynicism reached its peak with something called the Magnetar trade. A hedge fund named Magnetar Capital approached banks and said, we want to buy the riskiest slice of a CDO, the equity tranche. This made them look like investors confident in the housing market. But behind the scenes, they were buying massive amounts of insurance, CDS, against the rest of the CDO. They were effectively building a car, filling it with crash test dummies, and then betting on the car to crash. But it gets worse. Because they were buying the equity slice, they got to help select which mortgages went into the deal. They purposely picked the absolute worst, toxic rubbish they could find, the stuff guaranteed to fail. The banks, hungry for fees, let them do it. They sold these poisoned CDOs to unsuspecting pension funds and foreign banks as AAA investments, while Magnetar waited for the inevitable explosion. This wasn't investing. This was sabotage. By 2006, the notional value of these derivatives dwarfed the actual economy. The shadow banking system, the network of non-bank lenders and off-balance sheet vehicles, was larger than the traditional banking system. And it was completely unregulated. Nobody knew who owed what to whom. A bank might think it was hedged, but its counterparty was another bank that was also betting on the same housing market. It was a circle of people holding hands on a cliff edge. The Fed looked at the official inflation numbers and saw stability. They didn't see the dark matter of the financial universe, the trillions in synthetic derivatives that were about to violently correct. The system was now fragile. It just needed a trigger. In 2006, the music skipped a beat. House prices in the US stopped rising. They didn't even have to crash, they just had to stop going up. The entire subprime model was predicated on the ability to refinance. If you couldn't pay your mortgage, you just took out a new loan against the rising value of your home. But when prices flattened, that escape hatch welded shut. Borrowers were trapped in their high-interest loans. Defaults started to tick up. At first, Wall Street dismissed it. It's just a little froth, they said. It's contained. But the guys looking at the data, the Burries, the Eismans, saw the truth. The early defaults weren't random, they were systemic. The 2006 vintage of loans, the ones with the loosest standards, were defaulting within months of being signed. The foundation was rotting, but the skyscraper was still being built higher. There was a time bomb embedded in the calendar. Millions of adjustable rate mortgages, ARMs, issued in 2004 and 2005, were set to reset in 2007. These borrowers had been paying a low teaser rate. When the reset hit, their monthly payments would double or triple. The math was inescapable. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, and you can't get a $3,000 monthly payment from a waiter making $2,000. The default rate didn't just rise, it went vertical. As these payments stopped coming in, the cash flow to the CDOs dried up. Remember the champagne tower? The top glasses were still getting wet, but the bottom glasses, the equity and mezzanine tranches, were suddenly bone dry. Their value plunged to zero. But here is the terrifying part. The banks themselves were holding huge amounts of these super senior AAA tranches. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. In early 2007, two hedge funds managed by Bear Stearns collapsed. They were heavily invested in subprime CDOs. It was the canary in the coal mine. But the panic wasn't about the losses, it was about the valuation. Nobody knew what these CDOs were actually worth. Since there was no market for them, nobody wanted to buy toxic waste. There was no price. And in banking, if you can't price an asset, you can't lend against it. The repo market, the plumbing of the financial system where banks lend to each other overnight, began to seize up. Banks stopped trusting each other's collateral. You want to borrow cash against this AAA CDO? I don't think so. That looks like garbage to me. When the repo market freezes, the blood stops flowing to the brain. Banks that looked solvent on paper were suddenly liquidity insolvent. They had assets, but they couldn't pay the light bill. Throughout 2007, the CEOs of the major banks, Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, kept dancing. They were still paying themselves massive bonuses based on profits that were entirely illusory. They were marking their CDO assets at model price rather than market price. They were effectively saying, "My computer says this pile of dirt is worth $1 billion, so I'm a billionaire." It was accounting fiction. But the market always finds the truth. The indices that tracked subprime bonds, the ABX index, began to freefall. This index was the only transparent pricing mechanism, and it was screaming that the AAA tranches were not worth 100 cents on the dollar. They were worth 60, then 40, then 20. The leverage that had powered the boom was now working in reverse, crushing the equity of the banks themselves. March 2008. Bear Stearns, an 85-year-old institution, disappears over a weekend. It is sold to JP Morgan for $2 a share, later raised to $10. The Fed steps in to facilitate the deal, hoping this sacrifice will satisfy the gods of the market. It doesn't. The rot is too deep. The summer of 2008 is a slow-motion car crash. Then comes September. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank, hits the wall. They beg for a bailout. The government says no. They want to set an example. They want to eliminate moral hazard. So, on Monday, September 15th, Lehman files for bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy in US history. And instantly, the moral hazard argument looked incredibly stupid. Lehman wasn't an island. It was a supernode in the network. When they failed, hundreds of billions of dollars in trades, derivatives, and commercial paper were frozen. The Reserve Primary Fund, a safe money market fund for regular people, broke the buck because they held Lehman debt. Panic went viral. But the real bullet to the head was AIG. AIG was the world's largest insurance company. A division within AIG, called AIG Financial Products, had sold billions of dollars in credit default swaps to banks. They were the ones insuring the CDOs. They had collected premiums for years, thinking the housing market would never crash. They didn't even put aside money to pay the claims, because their models said the risk was zero. When Lehman fell and the CDOs collapsed, the banks turned to AIG and said, "Pay up." Goldman Sachs alone was owed billions. AIG didn't have the cash. If AIG failed, every major bank in the world that had bought insurance from them would become insolvent instantly. It was the end of the world. The US government had no choice. They stepped in with an $85 billion bailout, which eventually grew much larger, to save AIG. Not to help the insurance company, but to funnel that money through AIG to the banks. Goldman, Societe Generale, Deutsche Bank. It was a backdoor bailout of Wall Street. While the suits were getting bailed out, the real economy was being slaughtered. The credit freeze meant that companies like General Electric and Caterpillar couldn't borrow money to pay their workers. Small businesses saw their credit lines cut to zero overnight. Unemployment skyrocketed. Millions of Americans lost their homes. They didn't get a bailout, they got foreclosure notices. The wealth gap exploded. The people who caused the crisis, the bond traders, the CDO managers, kept their bonuses from the boom years. The people who suffered were the ones who had nothing to do with it. The teacher whose pension fund lost 40%. The carpenter who had no houses to build. It was a massive transfer of wealth from the public purse to the private balance sheets of the reckless. The anger you feel in politics today, the polarization, it started here. It started when the public realized the game was rigged. The crisis revealed that the entire global economy was levered to the hilt on a single asset class, American housing. When that asset corrected, it took down the GDP of the entire Western world. Global trade collapsed. Iceland went bankrupt. The Eurozone crisis began. The Great Moderation was over. We entered the era of quantitative easing. Central banks printing trillions of dollars just to keep the patient alive. They lowered interest rates to zero and kept them there for a decade. This inflated new bubbles in stocks, in real estate, in crypto. We solved a debt crisis by creating more debt. We solved a bubble by blowing a bigger one. And the fundamental structure of Wall Street, the too big to fail banks, they are bigger now than they were in 2008. How many bankers went to jail for the fraud that destroyed the global economy? 1. Karim Serageldin from Credit Suisse. One guy. For a crisis caused by systemic, widespread fraud, lying to investors, and rigging ratings. Why? Because the Justice Department decided that prosecuting the banks would destabilise the system. They settled for fines. JP Morgan paid $13 billion. Sounds like a lot, right? Not when you compare it to the profits they made. To a bank, a fine is just a cost of doing business. It's a toll booth on the road to riches. The message sent to Wall Street was clear. You can cheat, you can lie, you can blow up the world. If you win, you keep the money. If you lose, the taxpayer pays the bill. The incentives haven't changed. In fact, they have gotten worse. You might think CDOs are gone. They aren't. They just changed their name. Today, they are called CLOs, Collateralized Loan Obligations. Instead of being backed by mortgages, they are backed by corporate debt, loans to risky, indebted companies. The structure is exactly the same. The waterfall is the same. The tranche logic is the same. And the rating agencies? They are still rating the top tranches AAA. The market for these instruments is massive. And then there are the bespoke tranche opportunities, customized CDOs built for specific investors. The engineering didn't stop, it just went deeper into the shadows. The belief that we can use math to eliminate risk is the zombie idea that will not die. It appeals to our desire for certainty in an uncertain world. But math cannot eliminate the risk of human greed. Look around you today. Commercial real estate is shaking. The private credit market, loans made by non-banks, is booming in the dark with little regulation. We are seeing the same originate to distribute mentality return, just in different sectors. The leverage is moving from banks to shadow banks, private equity, hedge funds, insurers. The system is just as interconnected as it was in 2008, but the players are more opaque. We are walking the same path, comforted by the same assurances from the experts that this time is different, that this time the models work, that this time the landing will be soft. The 2008 crisis wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural disaster like an earthquake. It was a heist. It was a mathematical lie sold by the smartest people in the room to the most trusting institutions in the world. And the terrifying truth is that the machine didn't break. It worked exactly as designed for the people running it. They extracted billions in fees and left you with the wreckage. The CDO is just a tool. The weapon is the mindset. The belief that you can financialize everything, detach profit from production, and treat the economy like a casino. That mindset is stronger today than ever. The next crash won't look exactly like 2008. It won't be subprime mortgages. It will be something new, something innovative, something rated AAA that turns to dust overnight. And when it happens, you need to be the one who sees the waterfall drying up before the glass breaks. That is why this channel exists. We are building the radar for the next storm. If you want to survive the next wealth transfer, you need to understand the mechanics not the marketing. Stay skeptical, watch the incentives, and I'll see you in the next investigation.